A lot of times when people say the word coping skills, they usually mean defense mechanisms. But most people don't know the difference. So let's talk about it. Coping skills and defense mechanisms are not the same thing, even though they're often used interchangeably. That is a misconception and misunderstanding. They are very different and used very differently for different things and different situations. In general, coping skills are usually healthy things, and unhealthy things we tend to call them vices. Defense mechanisms are what you do usually for survival. Okay, and so I'm going to get into some definitions to help to break down what these words really mean and then what they actually look like. So, what are coping skills? The definition of coping skills is strategies that are used to manage stress, difficult emotions, challenging situations healthily. I want to add healthily. So, coping skills are strategies used to manage stress, difficult emotions, challenging situations in a healthy way, ideally, right? So, stress management tools, when you think about that, there's ways you can express, right? People may resort to violence and drinking or smoking. That would not be a coping skill. That is your response to stress, particularly. But because it's not healthy, I personally and professionally would not say it's a coping skill, even though that is your way to cope. I don't think that's valid because when you are doing that, you are not actually coping with the thing. You are avoiding by escaping when you are doing those things, which we may have to get into a little deeper a little later. But if you're grounding, deep breathing, practicing mindfulness, going for a walk, going to work out, things like that, taking a nap if you need it, you're now doing things that will manage your stress levels, that will lower your stress in a healthy way. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Now, a defense mechanism, on the other hand, is conditioned or are conditioned behaviors, thoughts, habits, or actions that help people avoid confrontation or conflict. So, again, going back to the other things drinking, smoking, driving fast, things going out partying, binging, whatever you're binging, those things, you're avoiding what's really bothering you. You're escaping. These are distractions. So you're not coping with what is. You're not facing reality. I guess is another way you can think of it. You're not dealing with what's going on. You're finding ways to not deal with it or not face it or not feel whatever feelings are coming up based on what's going on. When you are coping with something, you're acknowledging what you feel or the emotions that are present and dealing with them appropriately. Okay. And so I always tell my clients when it comes to defense mechanisms, I'm not against them. I just want people to use the right terminology and vocabulary. And the thing is, when people think their defense mechanisms are coping skills, when they're adults, they say, well, I've always done this since I was a kid. This is how I was coping when I was a kid. If you were going through something traumatic or devastating or bad, negative experience as a child, for the most part, kids are just surviving it because they can't tell anybody what to do. They don't have really much power or authority. They can't leave their parents' house if it's their parents. They kind of just have to endure what's going on. And so we naturally develop defense mechanisms as a survival instinct. So there are things you do in order to survive your circumstances, whether you question what's really true, you create a narrative that's different than the truth, that's easier and more manageable to deal with, and other things like that, because there's nothing you can do about it. Usually, if you're helpless, you find ways. Think about times where you've kind of said things weren't as serious, or if you swept it under the rug. You've minimized, or other people said, hey, it's not a big deal. Why are you crying about that? Oh, you don't need to be mad about that. And you're like, okay. Because as a kid, what you're going to do? Argue? And so you tell yourself, it actually wasn't that bad. I shouldn't have cried about that. Well, you probably should have. You probably were right to be mad, but no one was teaching you how to regulate and express your emotions, probably because it made them uncomfortable at that time. But usually, whatever you developed then are probably now are have always been and are now defense mechanisms, not coping skills, because it got you through that time period. It's kind of feels like it was a coping skill because it helped you. Now, here's the thing: just because you endured doesn't mean you cope, which is why you're probably in therapy or need therapy now as an adult. That's first things first. I always tell my clients what protected you when you were younger may hurt you now as an adult, and therefore it is not a coping skill if it is hurting you instead of helping you. What do I mean? If people didn't listen to you growing up and you had a habit of shutting down and you just kind of detach and whatever, and now as an adult, when things go wrong, you can't have uncomfortable conversations. You don't handle confrontation well. When people tell you something that's uncomfortable, you do not engage, you disengage, you retreat, and you shut down. You're not coping with the discomfort, you're avoiding it still. This is a defense mechanism. This is because you do not probably have the skills to cope or know how to cope. But not only that, you're trying to do what you can to survive this situation. And so that's why I said what was helping you or protected you specifically, things that protected you in childhood that you now do in adulthood may hurt you, because it is important to effectively communicate. It is important to know how to express yourself, receive feedback, have uncomfortable dialogue with other people, because you have to do that at work and in other instances in relationships, whether romantic or platonic, with family members, with friends. You're going to have uncomfortable conversations, and it does not mean you're in danger. And so while you may be triggered, and that's why you shut down, because this feels familiar from when you were young, you're not coping with it. This is your defense to feeling triggered. Why, for whatever reason you feel triggered. Okay, I hope that helps. And so there's different types of defense mechanisms to hopefully make you really understand. So if you do any of these things, if they resonate with you, you can better understand that these are defense mechanisms, not coping skills. Okay, repression or regression. So repression, you minimize things like I said, as well as a lot of people suppress. I don't know if that's on here, but you kind of blow things off. You may act in ways that are not appropriate. So a lot of times when people are in uncomfortable positions, they may retreat to childlike behaviors. You may start talking differently. Your tone of voice changes. Maybe you cry a lot easier. Maybe you shut down. You're having behaviors that you probably had as a child or that most children would have, rather than what would be considered more normal or acceptable as an adult in that situation. But the major ones are denial. Again, like I said, you tell yourself this isn't true. That's not really happened. Did that really happen to me? Did they really say that? Did they mean that? The answer is probably yes, but that would be hurtful. So it's better to question it and, in a way, gaslight yourself so you can feel better about it so it isn't as upsetting. Then there's displacement. Displacement is what it sounds like. You are placing your anger or your feelings where it doesn't belong. That can again look like other vices, and or say if people mistreated you a lot as a child or in certain situations, whether it was a sibling, a parent, even a teacher. And now, anytime you feel that same way, you have that trigger of feeling unheard or silenced, maybe now you lash out. And so now, as an adult, when people say or do things, you're immediately offended, and now you become defensive and use a defense mechanism, and you lash out on them and or your children or other people because you feel attacked even though you're not being attacked. And it's important to know that you feel attacked when you're not actually being attacked. Projection is also a common one where you tend to assume or put onto, similar to displacement, but you're not taking it out on other people, but you're putting everything from your lens. So when you think of a projector, you're showing big on a big screen, showing everybody else something else. You're doing the same thing, like you're exposing yourself in a way that you may not be consciously aware by accusing other people of things that are not true, assuming they are doing things that they may not be doing because that's what you would do, or that's what you've assumed other people, because of other people have done this to you. Okay. And then rationalization, you try to make sense of everything. I know I've been guilty of this, where you're like, well, I think women do this a lot too, where you're overly understanding. Well, they had a bad day, or if I wouldn't have done this, they wouldn't have done that. And my mom had a rough childhood, and that's why she treated me. And my dad, had to figure it out on his own. And so that's why he wasn't really around, but he's really a good guy. And that stuff may be true. It doesn't justify their behavior towards you, but we want to make sense of it so it's easier for us to digest or process or whichever word you want to use. And then there's reaction formation and sublimation. And then so with these, again, similar to the other ones, a lot of these are similar. And you may have used these words or heard these words and thought they meant other things until now. And so you may have a certain way you automatically respond to things. Like the moment you hear certain words or someone raises their tone of voice to a certain, you may automatically start crying. Like maybe you can't deal with people yelling at you, regardless of what they're saying. It just overwhelms you because it puts you back into the state of mind of a time someone else yelled at you and maybe you were harmed. Even if that was emotionally, it doesn't always have to be physical abuse, but this can be psychological. Now you have set reactions to things that are almost like automatic or natural responses to things. And I think this one specifically is why people think, oh, this is my coping skill. This is how I cope. And it's like, no, that's just how you respond because you've been through this so many times and this is kind of just second nature to you, unfortunately. And I'm sorry that that's what it is for you if you're experiencing that. But all of these things, again, repression, regression, denial, displacement, projection, rationalization, reaction formation, sublimation, those are defense mechanisms. That is how you respond to uncomfortable situations or predicaments, or if you're triggered and your body feels you're in a unsafe or negative predicament again, this is what it naturally does to keep you safe. So again, it might have protected you at one point of your life, but it's now hurting you because you have to learn how to regulate your emotions and communicate them so that you can have a better outcome or just have healthy conversations and healthy relationships with people. Whereas coping skills, on the other hand, your regulated emotions, you say, I am sad. What do I do when I'm sad? Oh, when I'm sad, what really makes me happy? Do I like ice cream? Do I want to watch my favorite show? Um, I know that can be seen as a distraction as well. But sometimes if you're responding in a way of, I've acknowledged the emotion and this will make me feel better, especially if it's something you can't do about. Sometimes reacting or regulating your emotions means somebody crossed a boundary and you need to implement a boundary, which will also be uncomfortable. But as a result of what's happened to you, you are no longer going to allow people to treat you that way, talk to you that way. That also can be an extension of a coping skill. The basic ones, like I mentioned earlier, are counting, whether counting backwards, counting to 10 slowly, taking deep breaths, grounding techniques, mindfulness techniques. You can look all these up to see if you like any of those, or journaling. All these things are saying, what's going on? What am I feeling? And what am I going to do about it that does not hurt me or hurt myself or have negative consequences in the long run? And that's why it is coping, because you are addressing and assessing the situation, not running and hiding or suppressing what's going on. When you are doing the other things, like using your vices, you're essentially shutting down your emotions and saying, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to hear that. We're fine, which is not true. You're not fine. Because if you were fine, you wouldn't be doing those things. I hope that makes sense.